Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I'm excited to give you another excerpt from Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt by Martha Sweezy. It's a gift that keeps on giving, this book. And this passage is actually about forgiving. And if any of you listened to the We Can Do Hard Things podcast with Glennon and Abby and Amanda, it would be sometime in January 2024. It was an episode that they did with Liz Gilbert, where she talks about letters from love, which to me are letters from self, capital S self, or capital S, capital E, capital L, capital F self, which is kind of like the divine, right? This unconditionally loving presence that just has unconditional positive regard for us and cares deeply about us. Anyway, there's an episode where Glennon writes a letter to, basically, I would say, to her parts from self about what forgiveness is. And it so resonated with my experience of forgiveness. And then I read this passage in Martha's book where she talks about forgiveness, and it's the exact same explanation, which again, to me is just confirmation that this is a truth, I guess. It's an experience of truth. So without further ado, let me read this passage to you. It's called Forgiving. So Martha says, protective parts have many reasons to be wary of forgiving. Would it lead to forgetting? There are parts who would like to forget and parts who would not. Would it cause vulnerability to the same insults in the future, right? If I don't hold on to this grudge, or like how difficult this was, how harming it was, what if then I'm susceptible to it happening again? She says exiles are still vulnerable. Would it mean condoning a transgression, right? Does forgiving someone else mean I condone what they did? That's not okay, right? Some people in the client's environment may approve of the transgressor's behavior, and some parts will try to appease transgressors. So again, there might be this tendency for some parts of us to forgive in order to try to placate or fawn or people please the transgressor or other people in our lives, so that we don't have conflict, so that we're safe. Would it foreclose justice? Even when justice isn't coming, the longing for justice is a good source of energy and a powerful distraction from hopelessness and despair, right? If we feel like maybe we couldn't get justice in our situation, maybe our parent or perpetrator has died or something like that, but it fuels us to want justice or want protection for other people in a similar situation. So that desire for justice gives us energy. What if forgiveness took that away? The client's protectors, she goes on to say, don't know what we know, which is that forgiving does not mean giving up on justice. It does not mean forgetting. It does not mean condoning. And it does not mean being more vulnerable. But these parts we'll learn. So again, I love the generosity, the hopefulness of this statement. These parts make sense. They just don't know what our infinite self knows. She says, and the client's self can choose to forgive without internal consensus. Parts do not, I feel like they can't without internal consensus, but we'll see what she means. Parts do not want to be dismissed, denied, denigrated, or otherwise silenced. But if, like people, they are included and treated with respect, they don't always have to get their way. Okay, I see what she means. And this is very true. A lot of times, the biggest thing that people in parts want is to be seen and heard and understood. So as long as, and valued, right? As long as they feel like you've really heard them and you value what they're saying and you value their good intention, they're a lot more willing to give a little, to say, so they're essentially they are giving permission for the forgiveness, but they might still not agree with it in a sense. Okay. So this is an example that Martha gives. It's called Eloise Survives Her Mother. Eloise was a 65-year-old cisgender heterosexual divorced German French American. In childhood, Eloise was subjected to Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This means that her mother had given her various inappropriate medications, starved her on the pretext that she was allergic to food, and taken her to numerous doctors, which gave her mother attention. So this is a terrible thing that can happen where a child is made to look like they have illness. It's protectors in the parent system for whatever reason trying to get attention or resources or whatever they're trying to gain from it, but at the child's expense. So Eloise comes in and says, I now see my mother in a long line of women for whom being female was practically fatal. Maybe some of them wanted children, but she didn't. She had ambition. She could tolerate a son because he could enhance her status, but a daughter was impossible. She hated me just like she hated being female. Now, we're jumping into this session at the point of epiphany, it sounds like, for Eloise. And I imagine that she's had a lot of sessions and a lot of work before this. So I just want to mention that because let me just make a side note here. In my experience, in myself and with clients, forgiveness is a natural thing that happens. It sounds like Eloise is coming to this. But a lot of times people try to force it prematurely, and that causes damage. It's a natural thing that happens once the parts of us who have been harmed are fully seen and validated and really parented by us, by our loving self. Then and only then can those parts let the parent or the perpetrator off the hook, in essence, which is forgiveness. We'll see more what forgiveness really means, but that should never be forced, right? A lot of people will say, they'll try to push it. They'll say, oh, but your mom had her own problems. She had her own abuse, or she had her own mental illness. She was doing the best she could. They'll try to push that understanding on a person before they're ready for it. And that can do a lot of damage. The person has to come by that understanding in the natural progression of first the damage, the harm, the trauma, the abuse being recognized fully and allowing them to feel the very righteous anger about that, the grief over what they did not have, what their parent could not give them. Full empathy and compassion for those wounded parts of us has to happen first. And then it's like, in my experience, again, with myself and my clients, it's like the clouds lift and suddenly they see their parent as a human instead of as this person that they desperately, and of course, desperately want to have attunement and love, loving attachment with. Once they have grieved that and understand they cannot have it, and they have secure attachment with the self, then they are free to see their parent as human. And what Glennon's self told her, or love told her in her letter, and what we'll see here, is that what comes is a perspective, a higher perspective. It's like they're able to lift above. And this is what's happening for Eloise here. She sees her mother in a long line of women where being female was practically fatal, and where having a daughter was impossible and was a curse, right? This was not personal to Eloise. She's able to see, like come to this 30,000-foot view and see not even just her and her mother, but the whole line behind her and the cultural context around it, and go, oh, my mom made sense. And maybe I can even have compassion toward her experience. But again, first, she must have compassion toward her own experience in order to genuinely get there. Okay, so she sees this perspective, and Martha says, what is it like to see her that way? And Eloise spontaneously says, I forgive her. And Martha says, all parts? I think she's asking if all of her parts forgive her mom. And Eloise laughs. She says, oh no, I have an angry 16-year-old who may always hate her. And that's okay, right? Our self has the ability to have that perspective and clarity and compassion toward others when we see the full picture. But we may still have a part that says, I will never come to acceptance of how I was treated at young age, right? And that's okay. That's healthy too. Martha says, how does she, the 16-year-old, feel about you forgiving your mother? Eloise says, she says, you can have your mother and I'll have mine. I love that, because essentially Eloise's self is her mother now, right? So she's like, in essence, I can let her off the hook. I don't want to be close to her, is basically what she's saying. She's harmed me. I need distance, even in a, esoteric way from my mother, who's probably passed. But if you want to be close to her, you can, right? There is this separate will of the different parts and the self allows all the parts to have their own free will. So it's beautiful. I love that. You can have your mother and I'll have mine. And Martha says, does she protect another part? I think she means, does the 16-year-old protect another part? And Eloise says, she knows the little ones feel better now, but that will not stop her from hating Harriet. So interesting. So again, she knows that the ones she protects are now securely attached, it sounds like, to Eloise's self. But she won't stop hating her mother. And it's interesting that she calls her by her name, which is actually a really helpful way of understanding, like separating, this is not my mother, this is a person named Harriet. And her protective parts and her cultural burdening did not allow her to love me and the younger parts of me and to provide attunement and secure attachment. Instead, her protective parts caused her to harm us. And I'm going to hold on to the fact that I hate that that's not okay, that this person named Harriet treated us in these harming ways, right? And that's what I think a lot of times we need in order to have healthy distance and to accept that a person cannot give us what we need. So Martha says, it seems like you two know each other well. And Eloise says, yes, we do. And Martha says, so she will tell you what she needs? And Eloise says, yes, she will. So beautiful. I love this example because it's this beautiful example of the relationship between the self and these parts, and that the self never forces them to be anything other than authentically who they are. And the self has no problem with that, right? So the self can see the bigger picture and see the context with which her mother Harriet was and forgive her. I say this wasn't personal. Poor thing, she was going through a lot. And at the same time, she can have a part that's angry that says, but the repercussion for us was not okay. Love it. So the last little note says, from the bird's eye view of herself, Eloise saw her mother in context and understood what her parts should not take personally. Okay, that's a wonderful summary. I'm going to read it again. From the bird's eye view of herself, Eloise saw her mother in context and understood what her parts should not take personally. That is the definition of forgiveness. Again, and it comes naturally from self once our parts are given the attention they need. But the self can have this bird's eye view. I often call it the 30,000-foot view of seeing the whole context in which her mother was and her mother's mother and all the lines and the culture, and says, ah, this was not personal. I see it clearly, right? The self has clarity and calm and confidence and compassion and connectedness. It just sees so clearly, has perspective. That perspective is forgiveness. And that's what self or love with a capital L told Glennon in her letter. Last sentence says, though her 16-year-old was not done with hating, Eloise got a good measure of peace from understanding that she was not responsible for her mother's rage and sadism. That's a huge, huge burden lifted, right? When we have the perspective to clearly see that another person's protective parts acting in harming ways toward us has nothing to do with us. It totally makes sense that young parts think it does. My own parts have told me when they take responsibility for parents or other people's behavior, it's because it's easier to believe that it's their fault because then they have some control over it. There's something they can do. It's actually harder for them when they're young to believe that it's about the other person, particularly their caregiver, because then they don't have any control, and that feels really overwhelming. This person that I'm depending on to survive cannot protect me. And that feels impossible for a young child to feel. So they take on the burden of, it is personal. It's my fault. If I was just better, more lovable, if I did the right thing, if I was good enough, my parent wouldn't treat me this way. But as we get older and we connect to the self can have that view and say, actually, no, it had nothing to do with you. It was unfortunate. It was terrible. And there's nothing you could have done. It had to do with your mom's upbringing, culture, all of her burdens. All right. So let me know in the comments what you think about that definition of forgiveness, that natural perspective that the self and the system can have once the parts who've been harmed have been validated. Let me know what you think in the comments.